Welcome everybody to the Anti-Muslim Hatred Working Group webinar. It's great to have so many people here and so many familiar friends and colleagues. So thank you for taking your time out to join us. My name is Professor Imran Awan. Most of you probably will know me. I do a lot of work around Islamophobia, particularly social media and Islamophobia and the different types of hate speech that occur online. I've worked on various projects and projects for Sara, as you probably be aware, and Tell Mama and other organizations. And I'm currently working on an ESRC funded project looking at conspiracy theories and Islamophobia. So as I said, lots of work to do, not enough time, and especially for our panelists, because we only have 3 minutes. So that's not good. That's going to be a challenge. As I said, this is the start of a series of webinars that the Anti-Muslim Hatred Working Group is doing. And today we're really pleased to say we're partnered with Faiths Forum for London. Some of you, or most of you, might be aware of them as an organization. One of the leading organizations tackling intolerance, hate crime, extremism through its research and evidence. So we're really pleased to have Faiths Forum partner with us today. I think it's also important to just say at the beginning that this webinar comes as at a really critical time because of what's happening around us. So whether that's the rise of white nationalist groups, but also racial inequality and Black Lives Matter. And we've seen this week, it being the anniversary of the death of George Floyd, marking a really significant part of why we were doing this webinar this week as well. It also comes at the back of the attack in Reading that happened just a couple of days ago. So it seems really pertinent to be talking about this, even though it's at a really difficult time for us. Just some quick housekeeping rules. We have only 1 hour. I say that loosely. Hopefully we'll try and stick to that time limit. People can ask questions. Please use the chat forum to do that. If you do have a question, write your question in that chat forum, and we will do our best to answer or get the panelists to answer all the questions. And it's best to say I can't promise that straight away because we know it's going to be quite challenging. In terms of the format, myself and Roxana will, after the introductions, talk a bit about our report, and then we'll pass it to the panelists, and we'll take turns, and they'll have 3 minutes to talk about their subject matter, which again, as I said, is a challenge. Before we start though, I just want to explain a little bit about the Anti-Muslim Hatred Working Group for those people that may not be aware. It's a group of independent members, diverse in terms of their expertise and skills, and geographically widespread. So from London, Leicester, up north to even Scotland. It's a huge diverse team and a team that brings a lot of expertise and experience. So again, it's really, I suppose, exciting and also a really interesting part to talk about our research, which was done on behalf of the group. Now, a bit about our speakers, and again, I'm conscious of time, and I'm conscious that I could spend a lot of time talking about their profiles, but I'll try and keep it brief. First of all, I'm really pleased to have Zaynab Albadry, who's joined us. She's the project coordinator for Stand Up to Education Against Discrimination. Zaynab will be talking a bit about her experiences of suffering or being a victim of Islamophobia on social media, but also her work in empowering young people to tackle different forms of hate crime, including discrimination, anti-Semitism, and anti-Muslim hate crime. Sara Khan is lead commissioner for the Commission for Countering Extremism. Sara has spent a lot of her time working up and down the country trying to find solutions to tackling the problem of all forms of extremism. And as I said, recently published a very important report, which I'm sure Sara will be sharing insights to when it's her time to speak. I'm not sure if Iman is here, but I should give the introduction because Iman might join us later. Iman Atta is director of Tell Mama and supports victims of Islamophobia. So if victims want to report Islamophobia, they can do so through Tell Mama, and they act as a sort of a conduit in terms of providing support for victims and one-to-one aftercare. Mark Gardner, I think, also will be joining us later. Mark is Director of Communications at the Community Security Trust, CST, soon to be Chief Executive. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say that, but yeah, Mark's had a really high rise in terms of the work he's been doing. He'll be talking about anti-Semitism And I think it's really poignant because a lot of the stuff we've done in our report links very much to what Mark is going to discuss. CSC also works with different communities to try and solve different problems, but also eliminate racism and also anti-Semitism. Areeq Chowdhury is director of WebRoots Democracy, a think tank focused on progressive and inclusive technology policy. I know Areeq works quite proactively in looking at different types of policy in terms of challenging social media companies. And a recent report I just read, which I thought was really fascinating, was Unmasking Facial Recognition, which I thought was a really interesting report about the minority effects on minority communities. So we're really pleased to have him also on the panel. Zahed Amanuallah is here as well after many attempts. It's great to see Zahed as well. And Zahed is a resident senior fellow of the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. He also has worked for many years tackling the types of hate crime and polarization within society and again extremism. And I was also very fascinated by the webinar that the Institute for Strategic Dialogue recently put up about American Jewish communities. It was a real eye-opener in terms of disinformation and how that works. Fascinating. I'm also pleased to say we have Yousif Al Khoei. Yousif is the Director of Public Affairs at Al-Khoei Foundation. He's also the founding member of the Mosque and Imams National Advisory Board, MINAB. He's also an independent member of the Anti-Muslim Hatred Working Group. Yousif will also be bringing in his expertise around sectarianism, some of the issues that we're starting to see in relation to COVID. Katie Minshall, who's head of public policy at Twitter, is hopefully joining us. I know she's at another meeting at the moment. It's also great to have Katie because she's also somebody who's worked with us very proactively to see what Twitter could be doing to tackle hate speech. So it's great to have her. Nick Adams also joins us. I think sometimes the police can be forgotten in all this discussion about hate speech. And it's great to have Nick, who's a coordinator for Prevent within policing. And Nick will be sharing again his expertise about what the police are going to be doing, particularly around offline incidents that may occur. Last but not least, Roxana Khan-Williams. I hope I've got everybody. Roxana is a support and development officer for the Anti-Muslim Hatred Working Group, but she does much more than that behind the scenes, helping the group with a lot of the work we've been doing. She's also co-author of the report that I wrote with Roxana for the Anti-Muslim Hatred Working Group, which is called Fear and Conspiracy Theories of Islamophobia. I think I've not missed everybody off the list. If I have, apologies, but I think we'll make a start on our report. And as I said, myself and Roxana will try and keep this short and then get panelists to have their presentations. And then at the end, we'll have Q&A for everybody. So to start off with, I think, why did we start writing about this report? As has been mentioned, COVID-19 has led to a lot of conspiracy theories, whether it's 5G, whether it's the fact that the virus is man-made, and lots of different types of incidents that have been occurring on social media. And what we really wanted to do was explore whether Islamophobia was actually being proliferated as well, and whether or not there was some link between the two. And what we found was that even though it was a snapshot of certain events, that these events were triggering responses in different communities, particularly from the far right, who were pushing this narrative and agenda that, you know, Muslims were super spreaders of the virus. And they were using this idea of conspiracy to really fuel alienation and antagonism with Muslim communities. And one of the things we found was that anonymity was one of the key drivers to this. People were using this, their anonymity and their social media status to really perpetuate this type of hostility. Quite often it's promoted around white supremacy, but sometimes it's just ordinary things. So if they saw people, or if they could push a narrative that people were actually attending mosques, then they would use that. If they could push another narrative around conspiracies that Muslims are actually breaking lockdown rules, then they use those as particular examples. And I'll mention those. Interestingly though, when we looked at the research, quite a lot of the fabricated material that was appearing seemed to be being dispersed very quickly and reaching a very large audience, in contrast to actual, if you like, legitimate sources. And if you compared it with sources that were actually telling the sort of truth or trying to find the truth, you found fake news going much quicker. And just some examples I'm going to mention quickly. The first one is of the Muslims supposedly praying in a mosque in Small Heath in Birmingham. And most people may have saw that video being pushed by the likes of Tommy Robinson on Telegram, but reaching a very wide audience as soon as it was posted. In fact, West Midlands Police debunked it and said, well, these are not people praying in any mosque. This is several weeks ago in terms of what's been showed. And somebody then started posting up tweets, and one of the messages was, we need to avoid muzrats, a word to describe Muslims as vermin, who are still attending mosques. And this was perpetuated by conspiracy theories. And as I said, we were trying to find these flashpoint events and try and piece the jigsaw together, which I think is so complicated. You know, it requires a lot of in-depth evidence. Again, just to end on some other examples before I pass it over to Roxana, West Yorkshire Police also posted a video, and people may have saw that this video was purportedly showing people outside a mosque in Leeds, and they had to quickly debunk it and say, well, you know what? This was taken weeks ago when pubs and clubs and everything else was open, and it wasn't during lockdown. And there was one of my favorites of this individual who called, he lived in Shrewsbury, who said that there was an issue with the mosque being open in Shrewsbury, and actually called the mosque apparently to say that they were breaching the guidance. And Shropshire Police quickly said, there is no mosque in Shrewsbury. So again, the trend was getting was really astonishing. And this is echo chambers, because then it reinforces negativity, and it also reinforces others to jump onto the sort of that wider sentiment that Muslims are breaching lockdown rules. And just finally, the other example I want to mention is the one of Muslims praying apparently in Wembley in London on the streets. Again, a video that was debunked as being several weeks ago, but I think it shows the climate that we're living in and the sense of polarization that was trying to be created by different communities. And that was one of the key findings we found. Okay, I'll pass over to Roxana.
Thank you, Imran. Yeah, before I get started, I just wanted to say thank you to all the panelists for being involved. It's such an honour to share this space with such an esteemed group of people. So yeah, thank you for that. So just to pick up from what Imran was saying, I would like to touch on a recurring theme that was appearing a lot in the content that we were monitoring, and that was one of national identity and fragility. So almost in a similar way to how narratives from Brexit constructed, the ideas of national identity were constantly being called into question in relation to British Muslims during the coronavirus crisis. So much of this rhetoric was the recycling of old tropes centred around ideas of an Islamic takeover. So for example, one tweet asked how long it would take for England to be renamed Englandistan, and others mirrored comments coming from India and spoke of a corona jihad, as if the virus was a bioweapon being used to push Sharia law through the back door. To put it simply, many on the far right saw the coronavirus crisis as another opportunity to lambast Muslims and place them in a position of responsibility for the spread and the existence of the virus. Feeding on from such narratives, a number of social media posts promoting a white British disillusionment narrative claimed that the police were biased towards ethnic minority groups and especially Muslims. Such comments would vary from claims that the police tiptoe around Muslims for fear of being called racist, to institutional cover-ups and claims that the Met Police are infiltrated by Muslims. All these narratives fed into false arguments that Muslims were flouting social distancing rules and still attending mosques, while police supposedly sit back and let them do it due to political correctness gone mad. So we can see how these narratives have become mutually reinforcing, and I think it speaks to why we've seen such a proliferation of these narratives on social media, both here in the UK and internationally. But before I hand back to Imran to conclude, I would like to add or finish on a positive note. And although we have seen the kind of proliferation of these really horrible and negative narratives, for the most part, what we've seen during coronavirus crisis has been amazing acts of community solidarity and community spirit. So I would like to end on a positive note, if I may. So yeah, back over to you, Imran.
Thank you, Roxana. Thanks a lot. Yeah, it is important to mention that we did see a lot of positive stuff as well, and especially the acts of kindness, people coming out in local communities, helping neighbours, going outside to hospitals and actually risking a lot to give others. So yeah, there was some really positive stuff as well. Okay, quickly moving on. As I said, we have an array of excellent speakers. Thank you all for joining us. I want to start with Zaynab Albadry. Zaynab is the project coordinator for Stand Up, Education Against Discrimination, and will be sharing some of her thoughts, particularly around empowering young people. Over to you, Zaynab.
Thank you so much, Imran. I just want to firstly start by saying that I'm really delighted to be speaking alongside experts from various fields on this matter. So thank you so much for this opportunity. I think the Stand Up project and the way that it's been created and set up is really powerful in breaking down stereotypes and some of the misconceptions that you've already mentioned about the Muslim community, as well as some misconceptions about the Jewish community. So just to give a brief overview of how it was set up, it's an interfaith charity led by Maccabi GB, which is a sports and wellbeing organisation that operates in all Jewish schools and with all strands of the Jewish community, and also a partnership between CST and Tell Mama. So the sessions that we always deliver addressing anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hate are always facilitated by a Jewish person and a Muslim person together. This means that when I walk into a classroom, obviously students can straight away identify me as a Muslim woman from my hijab, but this is less obvious for my Jewish colleague who is a modern Orthodox Jew and is less visibly Jewish. So at some point during the session, when the penny drops and they realize that we're a Jewish person and a Muslim person working together, they are really, really shocked. So some of the questions that we get is, don't you guys hate each other? So we always have a chat about it and break it down in a safe space. Now, why am I mentioning this? Is it a big deal if there is an idea out there that Muslims and Jews hate each other? It really does feed into some of the topics that were mentioned in the CSU report in relation to coronavirus conspiracy theories regarding the Jewish community, and also conspiracy theories regarding the Muslim community. If people start to internalize these ideas that these groups are oppositional, it's easier for people to believe pre-existing conspiracy theories about both communities. So to give an example, the CST highlighted that the Jews are blamed for instigating coronavirus, and the Anti-Muslim Hate Working Group shows that Muslims are blamed in spreading the virus. So it's these two groups working hand in hand to ensure the destruction of Europe, which really feeds into great replacement theories that are highly believed by the alt-right and are really popular now. And we know this from the work of Hope Not Hate, our partners as well. So we often highlight that the hatred of minority communities is often interlinked. I think the use of the word white, an attack against white people, is really important and interesting to talk about. As an organisation, we visit schools across the UK. This includes diverse, non-diverse, private, faith, grammar, mainstream schools, as well as provisional centres. And the word white is often used as the opposite of Muslim. Now, obviously, young people aren't intentionally othering the Muslim community, but also can't see that the two assume that the two can't go hand in hand. Other times comments are said which can notably be controversial. For example, in a school in Manchester not too long ago, when clarifying that our workshop will be focusing on Jews and Muslims, a student turned around to my colleague and myself and said, all I want in this country is white, normal British people. Is that too much to ask? And here we broke down the misconceptions, 3 particular misconceptions in the safe space. So firstly, that Muslims can be whites. We asked the students what they meant by the word normal, and also the fact that you can be Muslim and British. It's worth noting that when we speak to young people about Muslims in Britain, they often have no clue how Muslims contributed to rebuilding Britain after World War II, and instantly thinks of ideas of immigration, job takers, use our benefits, etc. On a separate occasion, I was also confronted by a student from another school, but this time to address kind of terrorism. So this was on the Isle of Wight, which was made up of students from white working class backgrounds who have never left the island, as they would like to call it. And it was directly following the attack on the mosques in Christchurch. And at this point, talking about terrorism, I felt quite vulnerable at the time, as I'm sure many Muslims did, quite upset by the incident. And a student confronted me and refused to address the incident as a terrorist incident. And their justification for it was that this person was an individual and didn't belong to a group like ISIS are. So my colleague stepped in, my Jewish colleague, and she addressed the situation by clarifying what terrorism means and the intent behind this specific perpetrator's attack. And I think this is one of the most powerful ways to tackle discrimination, cognitive dissonance. Specifically, as I said, when these two groups are seen as oppositional, having someone from the opposite, as they imagine opposite communities step in and address these issues is really powerful. Also, following this is something that our students also practice, cognitive dissonance. We rarely go into schools where there are Jewish students, and most of the time there are also like a small minority of Muslim students. And when addressing these issues, firstly, young people are very aware, and secondly, they will empathize, step in, and when we challenge them, they really do know the responses. Also, this is not just my experience. I hear from young people, there is a specific part during the session where we talk about hate crime. Have you experienced anything? And majority of hands go up at this point. They've either seen something or experienced it themselves, and that's on the streets as well as online. But it's really worth noting that often young people don't take online incidents as serious. They actually don't know that they are regarded as hate crimes. It's a separate and sacred space where they don't feel like anything should be reported. But what we like to highlight here is that the people who are online are also on our streets. The threat, as you said, is that following the relaxation of lockdown rules, that these attacks will maybe translate into street attacks.
Thank you, Zaynab. Thank you so much. Sorry, just because I'm conscious of time and we've got so many speakers, but thank you so much. It's so powerful. And well, I'm sure we'll have questions for you. If I can move on to Sara Khan now, who's lead commissioner for the Commission for Countering Extremism. And hopefully Sara will be sharing some of her findings with us.
Thank you, Imran, and thank you to Akila and the Anti-Muslim Hatred Working Group for inviting me to take part today. And thank you to Imran and Roxana for publishing a really important report about how extremists are exploiting the pandemic and in an attempt to whip up anti-Muslim hatred in particular. This is something that my commission has been gathering significant evidence since March, how this is happening, how they are doing it, the extremist narratives, activity, and the harm that this is causing. And the Commission's actually going to be publishing regular summaries, and our first one will be published in about 2 weeks' time. So looking forward to getting that information out so people are aware of the types of tactics that our extremists are engaging in. And Imran's highlighted many of those, the use of conspiracy theories, the use of disinformation online, misinformation, and the ease and speed at which this type of material can reach so many people. I think it's very frightening and very shocking for a lot of people when they see that type of material. And of course, this includes in particular the activity of far-right activists and organisations who have spread dangerous conspiracy theories about Muslims and Jews in an attempt to whip up anti-Muslim hatred and anti-Semitism. And we've got to be very, very clear about that. And I think the fact that some of this material has been viewed thousands and thousands of times in such a short space of time shows you the challenge that we have when we talk about countering extremism. And I think for many of us, particularly on this panel who've worked on counter-extremism issues for years, I think, it's fair to say a lot of us would find this, depressingly familiar and very, very familiar as well, actually. We're used to this type of activity from the far right in particular. When I published my report in October last year, again, we highlighted the tactics, the narratives of far right organisations and individuals in this country, how Muslims and Jews are repeatedly targeted, the narratives that are used, and it's frightening. And I think, yes, it can often feel quite depressing. But I have to say, we cannot be complacent or lose hope, because I think the work of counter-extremism is as urgent and important as it ever has been. And I think we have to invest in this work with renewed vigour, if anything. And it's why the Commission's report last year we called on the government to urgently and completely overhaul its current counter-extremism strategy. That strategy was first published in 2015, it's 5 years old, and as the only person who has reviewed that strategy, I made clear that I've said it's outdated, it's too broad, it's not effectively countering the activity of hateful extremists that Imran and Roxana have described in their report, for example. So we urgently need a new strategy, we need a whole society approach that will focus on countering these beliefs, these narratives, the behaviour and activity of extremists, but also doing more to prevent the harm of extremism and providing greater support for victims who often feel let down by the authorities or who don't feel they're supported. And we know from the evidence and the research into hate crime that the type of experience of victims who experience this type of hate can often be long lasting and have severe repercussions for victims. That counter-extremism strategy also has to grapple with the threat of online extremism, the scale of extremist content online that incites violence, hate, and even murder, which I see on a regular basis, I have to say, is deeply shocking. And I think we have to ask ourselves as a society, how can it be right in the 21st century that this material is not only easily accessible, but there's not enough done to prosecute repeat and persistent offenders and perpetrators? And I think this leads me on to the Commission's work into our legal review that we announced about 2 weeks ago. And this does concern me, that actually we lack an effective response or an ability to counter repeat and persistent offenders. You know, Imran mentioned some of those offenders. We often talk about, we're very familiar with some of the far-right activists and organisations in this country, and they are repeat and persistent offenders. Often it feels like our hands are tied behind our backs, that we can't do anything about these people who are stirring up hatred against others, who are undermining everything that we stand for as a democracy, that the rights of minorities are protected. That is what we stand for as a democracy. So when we see extremists engage in terrorist activity, they are often caught by robust counter-terrorism legislation. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of these extremist organisations that we're talking about, they make sure they sit below the line of terrorism offences. So they are inciting hatred, or they're engaging in persistent hatred or harassment, or they are justifying violence against others, whether it be Muslims, Jews, or other minorities. And often extremists know they will not cross over into the threshold of terrorism. So as a result, what we're seeing is many extremist actors and organisations continue to operate with impunity in our country, both online and offline, spreading and mainstreaming their extremist narratives, including anti-Muslim hatred, and radicalising and recruiting people to their cause. And that's why I felt it was important for the Commission to launch this legal review. And I've appointed Sir Mark Rowley, the former head of counter-terrorism at the Metropolitan Police, to lead that review, to identify, firstly, are there any gaps in our existing legislation, or are there inconsistencies in enforcing the law in relation to hateful extremism? And secondly, to make practical recommendations that are compatible with existing legal and human rights obligations. And we hope to present our recommendations later this year. I'm very conscious of time, so I just want to end by saying that, you know, this threat of hateful extremism, you know, it is complex, it is difficult, and it is challenging. But I think what the pandemic has done is helped to remind us once again of that threat. But we have to be very clear, inaction can never be a response, which is why my Commission will continue to press on the government to urgently publish a new counter-extremism strategy that is much more focused on dealing with the activity of hateful extremists. We are pushing the case for the proposed online harms bill and regulator to include taking action against hateful extremism, and it's why we're also carrying out a legal review. And the Commission is here obviously to support the work of organisations like the Anti-Muslim Hatred Working Group, Tell Mama, CST, and other counter-extremism organisations, because fundamentally, you know, your work is pivotal, and it's only by working together can we collectively reduce extremism in our country and to help live in a peaceful, plural and inclusive Britain. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sara. And apologies again, because of time, we are really pushed and stretched. Iman, I'd like to pass over to Iman Atta, who's the director of Tell Mama. And I think, you know, when we have a conversation about online hatred and offline hatred, it's really critical to hear the voice of Tell Mama and the work that they're doing. So if I could pass it to Iman.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you, Imran. Thank you, Roxana, and thank you, Akila, for organizing this webinar. I'll be brief, Imran, to allow other speakers as well to speak. So just following up and picking up on what you've mentioned and Roxana mentioned, as well as Sara, and really what we're seeing in terms of the spread of misinformation, the spread of fake news on the back of the pandemic, that continues to be the case. We have seen a significant rise in online hate reported to Talmama during the pandemic. It's now picking up really to take place on a street level with the ease of lockdown. But the dissemination of fake news and misinformation continues to be the case. Some of it connects Muslim communities to being the ones that are spreading the virus. Unfortunately, because of the death toll is the highest among BME people, as well. COVID-19 has been weaponized to attack Muslim communities as well as other communities within the pandemic, and as well both online and offline. And not only that, one of the things that we have to look at as well, and connecting extremism to hate crime, which is like, if you look at a coin, they both are two sides of a coin, is really how the far right are actually manipulating the language that they're using to promote their narrative and their extremist narrative to attack and pinpoint some of the marginalization and some of the attacks on minorities like Muslim communities and Jewish communities. So conspiracy theories, fake news, misinformation have been the peak of the online world during lockdown. Now we're moving into a world where lockdown is eased, where street level cases connected to the online world are unfortunately taking place. How do we work around that? How we engage all as communities to address this is something that we really need to reflect and review, because it's not the same as it was before the pandemic. While yes, and I do recognize that communities have come together during the pandemic, but unfortunately, the growing rise of far-right extremism and extremists from other communities have actually sown as well a growing division between communities. So this is something that I think we need to all reflect on, and we need, as well as representatives of different communities, organizations, is to really work with officials, work with police forces, work between ourselves as well to see how we can protect our communities and address these issues. One of the things as well that we need to look at is really how both the Jewish communities and Muslim communities have been put under the spot during the pandemic. It's something that, again, both Jewish communities and Muslim communities reflected on, and brings both communities together even in more solidarity to address the issues and concerns that are really highlighted against those communities. But another two communities that sometimes we don't talk about and we sometimes marginalize is the LGBT community and the disabled community, that unfortunately both have been hit as well quite harshly during the pandemic. So equally, as we have seen a rise in online hatred, in Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred, the LGBT community has, the disabled community has. And the same on a street level. And again, that calls really for the work to take place across all partners, for us to address the hate that is attacking our society, attacking our values and what we all stand for. We will be publishing a report on the findings of what we've seen during the lockdown, and also recommendations, and I look forward to working with you all on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Iman. That's really powerful, and it's so important to really put into perspective that this is a wider problem. It affects lots of different communities, and we have to be working together. Thank you so much. If I can pass it on now to Mark Gardner. And Mark is Director of Communications at the Community Security Trust, CST. It's great to have you, Mark. The subject of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia is so pivotal in this. So if I pass it to you now.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you everyone for taking the time and the trouble to join this call. I just want to say that the hatreds that have been expressed already, or rather that have been told already on this call, only in relation to coronavirus, only makes sense because people already had those hatreds, right? Doesn't make any sense to say coronavirus and Muslims are this and Muslims are that. It makes no sense unless you already have those themes, those racist motifs in society. And similarly, obviously, with anti-Semitism. And the point here is that when times get difficult, people want explanations for it. And whilst it may actually, to my mind, be quite a simple explanation to say, actually, this is a virus that probably started in China and it has scientific origins, A, B, and C. Nevertheless, for all of those people out there who interpret the world in different ways, they have to make this fit that interpretation. So, for example, we've had a lot of nonsense about how Jews are somehow or other connected to 5G telecommunications business, and actually 5G towers are spreading the virus. Now, this 5G conspiracy theory would make no sense whatsoever if we hadn't already had conspiracy theories about 4G, and before that, about 3G. So really what you just see here is an incredible example, very, very visible, because we're now tracking it all online, of how conspiracy theories are made to fit with whatever the current crisis happens to be. And I also think we have to consider what would have happened if this had occurred 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago, before social media was utterly ubiquitous, before it was everywhere, right? If the public basically only got their news from the BBC or the Guardian, and yes, even the Daily Mail and the Sun newspaper, you would not have had this profusion. Yes, there might have been the odd story that could be shown to be just plain wrong. And I love that you're able to show that these stories about particular mosques, Muslim communities, police supposedly said X, Y, and Z. I love that you're able to prove that these are wrong, because what that does is it helps to inoculate against this. It won't change the opinion of those who say it, because to them, whether they're right or wrong, it doesn't matter, because it illustrates a deeper truth anyway that they are privy to, because they're so much cleverer than everybody else. But it prevents their neighbors and other people. It prevents it from spreading. So it's so important to drill into each of these conspiracy theories. And if you have the opportunity to find something that is demonstrably wrong, you have to show it to be wrong, and you have to get other people on your side to speak out on your behalf, because they'll say, well, obviously the Muslims are saying that. But if the police say it, the local council says it, or Google Maps shows that there is no mosque, then you're beginning to hopefully get somewhere. Look, Jews have been blamed for creating the coronavirus so that Jews will profit from it, because Jews have got shares in pharmaceutical companies, or because Israel has developed a vaccine for a disease that it then invented so that it could make loads of money out of the vaccine, or because the banks are going to repossess your property, or because everybody's businesses, small businesses, independent businesses, are going to be absolutely in hock to the banks after this, and therefore the Jews will profit. So we've had all of that. We've had stuff that the virus is indeed real. Okay, the Jews didn't actually make it up, it is indeed real, but yet it's still a Jewish conspiracy for all of those reasons that I've just explained. We've had, exactly as Muslims have been blamed as being primary spreaders of the virus, Jews have also been blamed as being primary spreaders of the virus. And how do you prove that? Well, you then also, by the way, look at the Jewish death figures, which are way higher than national average, as are the Muslim death figures, and you celebrate those deaths because you're a sick racist and you love seeing that. And then you also say, let's spread it to the Jews. And so they've got this expression now called the Holocaust, playing on the Holocaust. Now, it's kind of easy to dismiss all of that stuff as ridiculous and as fantastical. But actually, if you consider all of the charges that comprise all of the types of racism that we suffer, all of those charges are fantastical anyway. You know, I consider it utterly fantastical that Jews supposedly control America. I consider it utterly fantastical that Jews supposedly kill non-Jewish children and use their blood in order to make things for our Passover festival. So I don't see this as being any more ridiculous than any of those other things. And actually, what happens when society is in crisis is that people move to the extremes. The confidence that we have in our mainstream political leaders and in the things, the institutions that protect our fundamental democratic rights, all of that erodes, and it erodes dramatically. And I think that's what we've seen already with coronavirus and the reactions to it. I think also it plays a part somewhere in the Black Lives Matter, the spread of that, because I think it's also feeding off other insecurities that people have about society. There's plenty to protest about in regards to anti-Black racism, don't get me wrong, but I think that the immensity of it all also speaks to deep unease around stuff to do with coronavirus, and a feeling that actually the politicians don't know what they're doing, the institutions don't do the job that we thought they did, and what is going to happen. And this, by the way, well before people realize the extent of the economic crash that we're all going to suffer from. And just to finish off on yet another negative, if I may, everyone's been cooped up indoors, right? And people's access to mental health, those that require it, they've not had that access. And then moving down one level, people's access to, if you like, moderating opinions from their people that they might interact with in their families or in their places of work, that's also been removed. So actually the amount of people who have been taking this in and have been obsessing about it and catastrophizing about it is going to be much higher than we are used to. And I think, yeah, racist attacks fell a wee bit because nobody was on the streets. And now they're going to bounce right back with an absolute vengeance. Sorry.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark. And it is a sobering reality check, really, that, you know, what's going to happen when lockdown totally eases. Just to let everybody know that I know we're slightly running over time. We will go past 2 o'clock, and so we will be taking questions and answers, hopefully. Apologies. Thank you again, Mark. If I can move on now to Areeq Chowdhury. Areeq is director of WebRoots Democracy, that's a think tank focused on progressive and inclusive technology policy. Over to you, Areeq.
Thank you. Yeah, just to add, so WebRoots Democracy is a think tank focused on technology and policy. Technology and policy reform, and one of the areas we've looked at over the past few years is social media regulation, and that started with a project we did in 2018 looking at online abuse in political debates, and since then we've done work looking at disinformation. Most recently I've been looking at deepfakes, which are basically AI manipulated video content on social media. The one key point I would want to get across in this few minutes I have is that this isn't a social media problem. This is primarily an offline societal problem. Everything we see on social media is just a symptom of wider problems in society around race and Islamophobia. And I would also push back actually against the framing of this issue as an extreme issue. I would say it's more of an issue in the mainstream. And we should be cautious about thinking of it as something that only exists on the fringes, because I think there's actually much more mainstream issues. So people like Katie Hopkins, for example, only exist because of actions and inactions which take place in the mainstream. And given that background, the main policy reform we've been pushing over the past couple of years is something called a civil internet tax. And what this would basically be is a tax on large social media giants to reinvest, which would be reinvested in offline anti-discrimination and digital literacy initiatives. So like Zaynab's organization, you know, that kind of real offline work is what's necessary to combat this issue in the long run. It'll never fully be solved by making tweaks on social media platforms. And also we should take a much more longer term mindset towards online abuse, Islamophobia, all of it. Because if we just focus on the platforms which exist today and how they exist now, we're only going to think about policies that apply to YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook, rather than thinking what's going to come around the corner. And with regards to coronavirus, I was thinking about this, you know, in preparation for this event, looking at coronavirus actually as an analogy for Islamophobia and racism in society. If you look at coronavirus, it's a global issue. It's invisible. It causes great harm and also causes deaths, right? And on the face of it, the scale of it is huge. You might think we'll never overcome it, similar to racism. But in 2021, 2022, we will have almost completely eradicated coronavirus. We'll slowly go back to normal life. And the reason for that is because we're spending literally trillions of pounds in fiscal support, in producing vaccines, trialing different things, even if we don't know that they work for sure at the beginning. And we're changing our way of life. We're seriously making a global community effort to combat this virus of coronavirus. So if we were to be serious as a society about tackling racism and Islamophobia, we should take exactly the same approach as we are to coronavirus, which is to acknowledge that this is a global issue, all of us are going to have to take some sort of action to combat it. And we need to spend serious hard cash in investment in actual projects which may or may not work in combating these issues in society. Because everything we see on social media, okay, there are bots and things like this. First of all, those bots are usually created by humans. And second of all, most of the content you see, you're seeing shared is being shared by people we live amongst in our society. And schools is a really important part to look at. Also, people who've left the education system, how are we reaching out to them? That's going to require hard cash, hard investment. So the main policy reform we've been pushing on this is really to move away from just punishments or sanctions or tweets on social media to a much longer term thinking and much more longer term investment in ways we can combat abuse in the real world and those sorts of mindsets in the real world.
Thank you, Areeq. No, that was really important, and touches on the point Mark made. Sorry about this is actually how people are reacting, and it's not just a social media issue. We should be looking at the offline incidents in that space. Thank you very much. I want to pass it over now to Zahed Amanuallah, who's resident senior fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue.
Thanks, Imran, and thanks to everyone who's contributed so far. I think I'm in agreement with a lot of what's been said, and I'll try to be complimentary to that in the few minutes I've had. One of the ways we should be looking at this is that we've got a perfect storm, if you will, of pandemic-related anxiety, social injustice, as we've seen with the George Floyd killing and subsequent protests, xenophobia in general. Mark made a great point about how these issues have existed for a long time. It's not just that we're seeing them for the first time. You've got to look at the political polarization that we've had, particularly with authoritarian governments and how they're leveraging onto these issues as well. And then the social media landscape, how social media is being used to further a lot of the conspiracy theories and hate that we see online, but also how they're building a response to that. And we've seen that recently, for example, with the moves that Twitter has made on misinformation with either Donald Trump's tweets or banning Katie Hopkins. Facebook is, finally sort of removed a post from Donald Trump that had a symbol used by Nazis. So we're seeing movement in all these cases. But the interconnected nature of all of this is something that we, if I can talk about ISD's role, I mean, we are trying to identify these trends, looking in the darkest corners online and looking specifically at the far right and how they've leveraged the coronavirus issue in many ways. We've seen, QAnon conspiracy theorists leverage this. We've seen, I don't know if you've heard of the Boogaloo, which is a hashtag that's been, promoted by extreme right-wing actors, looking at the deep state in the U.S. and looking for, conflict on racial grounds. It's all very interconnected, and it's important to understand how all of these exacerbate Islamophobia as well. We've seen, again, George Soros, the trope that keeps on giving is rearing its head more and more. It's one of the things that we've tried to do is, as part of our work is, in addition to mapping these trends, is to try to look for ways for communities to be more empowered and more informed, and also to work together on this. I think the point's been made before about how Jewish and Muslim communities both being equally targeted by these, particularly these right-wing groups, have sought common cause in trying to resist it. And I think that's something we want to really continue, because I think, especially if you look in the United States, and I'll we've seen a lot of instances where they're both equally under threat. Just while we're on this issue as well, because it hasn't come up one of the things when we're talking about Islamophobia specifically and looking at COVID-19 is the phenomenon that took place, been taking place in India, often referred to as the Corona Jihad phenomenon. It's probably the biggest example of Islamophobia being tied into the current pandemic, and that's of course a result of the tensions that have existed for a long time, specifically against Muslims by the sort of right-wing Hindutva actors in India, and that's of course exacerbated again by an authoritarian government and by all the other pressures that are coming forth as a result of a response to this pandemic. And those, we've published a report on this. I can put links in the chat regarding Corona Jihad, but also those have spread to the West, through communities, South Asian communities living in Europe and America, and then of course picked up by those who find them opportunistic. Again, that's burned on it. Again, the same things that we've heard that have happened in the UK, that you guys have that have been referenced regarding, Muslims being super spreaders and so forth. These things have resulted in violence in India, and the patterns are recognizable. And I think that it's important to track this stuff so that we can understand how these things spread and how they conflate. With regards to Islamophobia, I want to bring this up again because again, the recent protests around George Floyd and social injustice, that it's been brought to the fore, even though it's not Corona Jihad. I mean, it's not related to the pandemic per se. It's been one additional factor that's played a part in some cases being leveraged for Islamophobic reasons. I'll just give you an example quickly. In Minnesota, you've got the Attorney General, Keith Ellison, who's first Muslim elected to Congress, who's now responsible for charging the officers who were involved in that killing, Ilhan Omar, who was the representative from the district where the killing took place, and how that plays in to being exploited for Islamophobic reasons. And I think it's just important to keep all of that in mind, the entire ecosystem of Islamophobia.
Thank you so much, Zahed. I'm really sorry, just conscious of time. But yeah, the links would be great. And hopefully we'll be able to share those with the panelists and anybody else who wants to have a copy. Thank you. If I can move on now to Yousif Al Khoei, Director of Public Affairs at the Al-Khoei Foundation, and also founding member of MINAB, who's going to talk a bit about sectarianism. Yousif?
Thank you, Imran. I'm actually going to talk about the countries around the world which persecute religious minorities, and the current virus has really given them an opportunity to increase their persecutions. And I think India was mentioned, so I'm going to concentrate on China, Rohingya, Pakistan, and countries in the Middle East like Lebanon and the West Bank. Essentially, as everybody said, these are endemic problems which exist in such societies, but the virus has given really an opportunity for people to exert their hatred of these minorities. If we look at, for example, Uyghur in China, you see around 2 million people living in extreme difficult positions, like in camps and with overcrowding and a lot of negativity about them in society, and they can't even, the world doesn't say or know much about it. The same with Rohingyas. We have so many refugee camps, overcrowded. The authorities have disconnected the internet, so they are in real dire situation. In Pakistan, you have Christian minorities and Hindus who are subject to hate speech as well as discrimination terms of employment and access to health facilities, which again, not many people in the world speak about this and try to address it. You have the Hazaras in Pakistan who've again been subjected to a lot of blame for spreading the virus. A lot of their women have been particularly affected. They have been denied treatment, and the story goes on. In Lebanon, the Syrian refugees have been again subject to a lot of discrimination and hate speech. In the West Bank, many Palestinians who live in very overcrowded positions are subject to very similar conditions. You also have other communities who are migrant workers or refugees or the Romas in Europe. They have all been subject to increased hate speech and discrimination. I believe we kind of really need to highlight this more. These people who do not have much lobby power, who are the minorities who do not have the voice in the international community. And it is really our duty to sort of try to highlight them as well and not just go for the issues which may be more popular. The issue
Thank you,
of Islam.
Yousif. I'm really sorry, Yousif. Just because I'm conscious of time, I'm going to have to move on, and hopefully there'll be, if there's any questions, we can come back. Thank you again. Really
I
important.
actually finished.
Okay, thank you, Yousif. Just to let you know, at 2 p.m., I believe Sara Khan needs to leave. She has another conference call, and again, apologies because of the way we've slightly overrun. If I can just pass on to Katie Minshall from Twitter now. Katie is the head of UK public policy, and again has done a lot of work with us and other organizations. So over to you, Katie.
Thanks, Imran, and thank you for having me. Let me start by saying that hateful conduct has no place on Twitter. Language like that, like some of that shared in the report, can have repercussions both on and off the service. I'm glad to say that much of it has already been removed, and we're reviewing the remaining tweets right now. We're absolutely committed to working collaboratively, including with the organisations on this call, to attack the root causes of extremism and hate online. So in my remarks, I'd like to just talk first about some of the work we've done to combat hate on Twitter before moving on to some of the work that we have planned going forwards and how we're going to approach it. So in terms of what we've done so far, we've long had rules in place against hateful conduct. So that is that you may not promote violence against or threaten or harass other people on the basis of religious affiliation or any other protected category. But two key developments I'd highlight from over the past 12 to 18 months are, first of all, expanding our rules to consider offline harm. So in particular, last year, we expanded our hateful conduct policy to include new rules around dehumanizing language. That is, you may not dehumanize anyone based on their membership of a religious group. Critically, as this speech has long been proven to be associated with offline harm. Second of all, I'd highlight that an objective of Twitter has been to reduce the burden on victims of such hate to have to report that content to us. And so we've really tried to double down on using technology to find that content for us and lift that burden on victims. Now about 1 in 2 of the tweets we remove for abuse, we have detected proactively, and hopefully that will grow going forwards. So what are we going to do next? Well, we've done a lot of work thinking about our rules and how we enforce them. I think what you're starting to see now with Twitter is more consideration about how we can use Twitter, the product, to combat hate online. So to give it an example of this, we've got a couple of experiments running right now. Last month, we launched a new limited nudge trial And that is that a nudge will highlight when someone is sending a potentially harmful reply to a tweet. If the language in their reply is similar to that seen in reported tweets, we're going to ask them if they'd like to revise that language before sending that reply. So the aim is to change behavior and encourage people to reconsider their words. Second thing I'd highlight is we also launched last month a trial around turning off replies or choosing who can reply to your tweets. The thinking being that everyone should feel safe tweeting, but to make that happen, we really need to change how conversations work. Currently, repliers can shift the topic or the tone of a conversation and derail what you want to talk about. So the aim here is to give people far more control over their conversations. I'll end on just flagging how are we going to approach this work going forward. And I think this is the most critical thing I'd want to highlight here. We're going to do it openly and in partnership. We're the only major service right now that makes public conversations available for the purposes of study. Tens of thousands of researchers have used our public API over the past decade. And we see that as a big opportunity to form closer partnerships to think about challenges like the ones we're discussing here. In March, we announced a new, more focused research partnership with New Zealand's National Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies. In the aftermath of the Christchurch attack, we embarked on a joint project trying to analyse the way in which Twitter and social media more broadly was used for both positive and negative purposes. And going forwards, the aim of this partnership is to understand the ways in which social media can be used to promote tolerance and inclusion rather than division and exclusion. So thank you for your time and look forward to questions. Thank you so much, Katie. And I can vouch for everything you've said, really, because we've worked in close collaboration around some of the stuff you mentioned, particularly around harmful content and dehumanizing language. If I can move on then, just finally to Nick Adams. Nick is the National Coordinator for Prevention within Policing. And as I said, sometimes neglected are the police within this whole space of hate speech. So over to you, Nick.
Thanks very much. Probably in some respects, I think going last is really important. It allows me to draw on the fact that policing ultimately is only able to deal with a very small part of this problem, taking people to task, holding offenders and bringing offenders to justice when crimes are committed. You know, right at the upper end of that. And actually the solutions, as people have talked about really powerfully, sit with communities, they sit with other organisations, the sort of technological solutions that we've just heard about. There are lots of other areas where police can support, but I think, you know, it's right that policing is only, and recognised it's only part of the solution. Look, I've been a police officer now for 20 years. I've spent most of my policing service working in neighbourhood policing in partnerships with communities. I spent 10 years working as a chair of governors in an 800 pupil inner city school with over 95% of the pupils were of Muslim heritage and from a whole range of backgrounds. And I've spent, you know, years working with and supporting people going through hate, but I'm no expert in any of this. And prior to taking up this role, I worked operationally in policing in Leeds, and going back to your report and the fantastic example of my home force, West Yorkshire Police, coming out really quickly and supporting challenging of that kind of false narrative. It's just so important. And having worked in Leeds City Centre, South Leeds, East Leeds, that was a sort of approach that was taken kind of day in, day out by policing. But as I said, we're only one part of the solution. I think some of the most powerful solutions to this lay in those who have been involved in hate themselves in the past. And I, in my work within Prevent, see some fantastic examples of individuals that have been members of right-wing groups in the past, now devoting their professional and personal lives to diverting other people away from hate, to providing really powerful narratives. And somebody spoke earlier about the importance of that range of voices in this space to challenge this. I think, you know, again, really important as part of that solution. There are also fantastic examples of community projects. Catch is one up in Leeds that I used to be involved in, run by a young police officer that brings together hundreds of young people from different backgrounds at an early age to learn about each other, to grow with each other, to solve community problems together. That for me is the sort of fundamental solution to some of the problems that you've talked about. We in policing obviously have hate crime panels, and I used to work closely with community members looking at our response to hate crime, which is always to take in policing a zero tolerance wherever we can. But we've certainly seen that kind of growth, as others have talked about, within and during COVID, of the exploitation of narratives within extremist causes. And extremists will exploit absolutely anything. Mark talked really powerfully about this. When we get to the end of COVID, it will be something else. It is, you know, that is what extremists do. They look for opportunities to divide, to drive hate, to sow fear, to cause tensions within communities, to drive their own agendas. And we've all got to be alive and alert to that. We've certainly seen within the conspiracy theories, opportunities being seized by groups, right-wing groups, that may not be able to attract people into some of their core narrative to start with, their hateful narrative, but they can draw them in on the conspiracy theory issues around 5G. And once they've got them into those closed echo chambers, they can then start to feed in and layer on some of the other stuff that your report calls out really powerfully, blaming Muslims for the growth of the coronavirus and the spread of the coronavirus. And people use any hooks they can to deal with that and to take some of that stuff forward. So, you know, for me, and certainly in Prevent, our concerns have been, as others have talked about, that those opportunities within education settings at the moment, where teachers and professionals can work with young people to provide challenge to some of those hateful narratives, the conspiracy theories, the false information and disinformation, that's not there. And that's what we want to see being delivered in terms of preventing people from being drawn towards extremism and these groups in the first place. And we will continue to work with a whole range of organisations now as we come out of the back end of COVID, to make sure that the things are in place to get mental health support for people, to get conversations up and running again, but mostly to make sure that communities are safe when people go back onto the streets in the coming days and weeks, and making sure that where there are hate crimes perpetrated, that we're there to support people. So it's a final plea is for people to come forward and report things when they are victims, to share that information, because it's only with that we can make sure we put the right resources into the right places to help and protect people.
Thank you so much, Nick. Yeah, thank you so much. And I think it's a excellent way to end in terms of the panel session on reporting this stuff. If you're finding it, please do report it. Thank you so much. I just want to say thank you to all the panelists, because I know it's been a challenging time, and I'm being a stickler for the rules, although I've tried to keep it as fair and down the line as I can. But thank you so much all. I want to open it now to questions and spend about 15 to 20 minutes to just take some questions. And I know there's lots and lots coming through. So as I said, I can't go through all of them, but I'll try and get through as many as we can. If I can first go to Mustafa. Is Mustafa there? If Mustafa wants to address who the question is to and what the question is.
Hi there. So we have a number of questions. First question is to, sorry, while I'm putting my screen up. We have one question. How can we work, sorry, I've got some, how can we work towards impacting the perceptions that the wider public has of the Muslim community, specifically focusing on young people and the education system? So looking at how can we change the public perception on Muslim communities. And I think maybe we direct this question to Zaynab Albadry. You need to unmute yourself here.
Over to you, Zaynab.
Thanks.
Yes.
I just want to say that this is something that's been echoed by the panelists today, which is the work together. We can't work on this project separately, specifically when we have lots of areas in which we can connect, learn from each other as well. I think that's what work through education is the most important, because then you tackle these issues as they begin to develop. So, you know, in sessions when students say comments that are quite controversial, I never blame them. I'm actually really glad that they bring these comments to the classroom as opposed to saying them after we've left. You know, perceptions of the Muslim community being alien, that's because of the narratives that they are hearing. Muslims and fear-mongering about immigration, taking jobs, benefits, instigators and supporters of terrorism, Sharia law, grooming gangs. These are all the narratives that they are hearing on a mass scale being circulated, whether that's through social media or print media as well. So I think that great representatives from these communities is also really helpful. Obviously, it's unrealistic that every single person will meet a Muslim at some point during their lifetime, but I guess it's about representing these communities within schools, most importantly, work on identity, diversity, contributions of different communities so that they are not alienated and othered.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Zaynab. We have a question from Yousif. Is Yousif there? Would Yousif like to direct a question?
Is that me?
Yes, Yousif Al Khoei, yes.
Well, I was wondering, it's a pity that Sara left. We have a situation where the issue of Islamophobia has been politicized. People are taking two sides of political persuasions, saying, some saying you need to have a definition, some others saying, no, we don't need a definition, but this definition, but they don't offer alternative definitions. This issue of definition would be, in my view, a key in ensuring that the law really ensures that Islamophobia is disallowed. And the longer it goes on, especially when it has the support of the overwhelming majority of Muslims, the longer it goes on, it can only help to not finding a solution to Islamophobia and being exploited by extremists who like to say this system or this country is not treating Muslims fairly. How would some members of the panel respond to that?
Would anybody like to respond to that? Any of the panel members? You'll have to unmute it. No, I don't know. Yousif, was there anybody specifically you wanted to answer that question?
Well, our colleague, I think it's not really fair to expect him from Prevent to answer that question, but I was hoping that Sara would be in to address that question.
Nick, is that
Sorry,
something?
Imran, can I add a point, please?
Yes, go for it, Zaynab.
I was just going to say that when it comes to addressing anti-Muslim hate, it's really helpful, I think, for both the Jewish community and Muslim community to work together in terms of definitions. And I know that there are two main groups who are already doing that, but once we have a government adopted definition of Islamophobia, I think it makes it less likely for people to firstly deny that it's existing, and also to always respond to it by saying it's a way to shut people from criticizing Islam itself, as opposed to targeting the Muslim community. So I think if there is anywhere to start from, it's definitely by having a definition.
Okay, that's great. No, thank you. Nick, did you want to add something?
I'll just add in to say, absolutely echo that. Obviously, one of the challenges in trying to lead Prevent is often the criticism about the lack of definition and clarity over what it is that we're seeking to prevent people from being drawn into, and the links between extremism and terrorism, and trying to make sure that vulnerable people aren't drawn in on a particular journey. So anything that provides us with clarity and definitions, you know, police, we work in legal frameworks all the time, so we are used to applying the law, applying tests to things. And I think, you know, defining Islamophobia, defining extremism, Sara's commission doing lots of work around this, looking at whether there is a need for additional legislation. All of that helps us to be much clearer. There are invariably lots of challenges that come with that in making sure that what we don't end up doing is politicizing, you know, policing, but it's really, really important for us that we have and work with absolute clarity in this. So we would, you know, we're keen to support any work that's done to take that forward.
Thank you so much.
Can I speak to that, Imran?
Yes, yeah, go for it.
Sure. Look, from the Jewish community, to be honest, the definition of anti-Semitism question has brought an awful lot of unwelcome animosity and a lot of exceptionally unfair criticism. none of which should deter the Muslim community or anybody involved in anti-racism from stressing that actually, if there is a working definition, be it of Islamophobia or of anti-Muslim hatred or whatever other expression is decided upon, it's a very, very important step. It's very important because of the message that it gives to those on the receiving end of the racism, that their concerns are taken seriously by government, by police, by authorities everywhere. And also, it's not, I say working definition because it's not a definition. Anybody who can be shown to have fallen within one of these pigeonholes or paragraphs is by definition a racist. It can't really be that, because the definition of who's a racist has to be decided by a court of law, ultimately. And it'll be whether or not you've broken certain aspects universally that would apply across any race, religion, ethnicity, nationality. Rather, it's something that says, do you know what? If it fits within this set of circumstances, the onus is to investigate whether it is racist or not. It may well be. The onus is to further investigate. That's why it's a working definition. That's why all the way through these things say may depending upon context, may depending upon context. And it gets very, very boring. But the truth is, it may, depending upon context. But we're making a point here. We're saying, look, we appreciate there ought to be an aid for police, CPS, your local school, the local swimming baths, whatever, to decide if the way that this person was treated may, depending upon circumstance, have been racist, have been Islamophobic, have been an example of anti-Muslim hatred. So let's not go overboard on what the definition can achieve. It doesn't suddenly make everybody an anti-Muslim racist or an Islamophobe who you might think breached clause number 19.5. Rather, it just helps to set a framing that should lead to a more constructive environment for all concerned.
Thank you, Mark. That's really important. And I think sometimes we misconstrue the legal parameters around definitions. So, Yousif, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I want to say, that, to be honest, it will not change everything overnight, a definition, but at least it will give the legal framework where people who are Islamophobe can be tried in a court of law, which what happens today if you are an anti-Semite. Thank you.
Thank you, Yousif. Okay, I have a question for Katie from Jeremy. Katie, still with us? Katie, this question is, most of the far-right anti-Muslim or anti-Semitic tweets I see are anonymous. I am sometimes hesitant to respond because I am not anonymous. Facebook is not anonymous. Is Twitter planning to review its policy on anonymity?
So it's a great question. I think just taking a step back, the rules on Twitter are that you can be pseudonymous, not anonymous. So if you sign up to Twitter, we're going to ask you for your name and email address or phone number. We have very black and white rules about fake accounts. So I couldn't set up a Twitter account saying I'm Imran Awan with your photograph and claim to be you. I couldn't create multiple accounts trying to spam a certain hashtag and artificially disrupt or amplify a conversation. And what's important here is these are behaviors that algorithms can detect at scale. So it means over the past few years, we've got far better at cracking down at scale on any account, be them pseudonymous or kind of their full name, if they're trying to disrupt the conversation. I think the key thing here is whether an account is pseudonymous or has someone's own name, we will review it in the same way in accordance with our rules. So being pseudonymous doesn't protect your account from having action taken against it if it breaks any of our rules on abuse or hateful conduct or any other violation. And I think the other key thing here is at any point, the police can reach out to us we've got a specific portal for the police to make requests. It's staffed 24/7. The police can request all sorts of data which isn't publicly available to support them in their investigations as well.
Thank you, Katie. Now that's really helpful, and yeah, it's an excellent question. Is Afzal there? Because there's a question from Afzal. Is Afzal there? No, no Afzal. No. Okay. Question for Iman from Tel Mama. Iman, have you seen any relationship between some of the online and offline incidents in relation to anti-Muslim hatred?
Absolutely. In many of the cases where we see attacks that are made, that are anti-Muslim in nature online, they're actually being taken to a street level by individuals that would have been either radicalized online, or individuals that take their anger after being within echo chambers that are all the time putting out anti-Muslim rhetoric. They will take their anger one day on a street level. So example would be, if you are an individual who's seated behind your screen all the time, one example would be now the lockdown, and you are within echo chambers of far-right groups or extremist groups that are promoting anti-Muslim narrative, talking about Muslims and misinformation around Muslim communities, weaponizing COVID-19 to attack Muslim communities, and connecting Muslim communities to many other conspiracy theories. And then eventually lockdown eases and you go out and you see a woman who is visibly Muslim, who is wearing a headscarf walking down the street. Individuals have taken their anger on women, have taken their anger on individuals who are from Asian backgrounds, have taken their anger on institutions as well as mosques. So one of the things that we need to think of as well is vandalism that is taking place as well in places of worship. So today, the online world and the offline world intersect. They totally connect. And we cannot just talk about online hatred without speaking about street level hatred, because they both are actually reinforcing each other.
Thank you so much, Iman. That's really important. And sometimes, again, it's lost in this discussion. Is Afzal there? Afzal Khan?
Hi, yes, this is actually Anisa on behalf of Afzal Khan.
Hello, Anisa.
Hello, thank you for all your contributions today. That's been really great. My question was for Nick, actually. Thank you for your contribution today. The government has long announced that it's going to review the prevent strategy. I just wanted to know what your thoughts were on this.
As sort of National Police League for Prevent, I've supported from the outset the concept of having a review of Prevent. I think it will show the fantastic work that is done. It will show the support that goes into protecting vulnerable people within Muslim communities from being drawn into extremist groups. It will also show the support that's provided to Muslim communities by tackling right-wing, far-right hatred. And I think, just in terms of the relevance of the conversation today, we would want that review to have taken place 12 months ago when it was supposed to have taken place. It's disappointing that there have been delays and a false start with that. So I really hope that the government is able to quickly now find somebody who is got the skills, I suppose, so is a suitable reviewer in that sense, but is somebody who can be truly independent, who will have the confidence of all communities, and will be able to conduct a review that will then have the kind of credibility that it needs to have, so that whatever recommendations it makes, whether they are to completely abolish Prevent, replace it with something else, tweak it, improve it, whatever those recommendations are, that they're credible and they're things that we will be able to accept and turn into actual delivery to keep communities safe, but also to help build the trust and confidence of communities. Because going back to what I said on my pitch, ultimately, it's only the trust and confidence of communities, people coming forward, sharing with us concerns about hate, about radicalisation, about extremism, that we can actually work together then with other agencies, with communities to intervene. And without that kind of trust and confidence, that's the glue that holds all of this together. So for me, let's get the review up and running. Let's do it. Let's do it quickly, and let's turn whatever the results are and the findings are into a solution that helps us keep people safe from a very real problem that we're all facing.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Anisa, for that question on behalf of Afzal. Question for Areeq. Areeq, did you notice any trends or patterns in some of the work you've been doing in relation to COVID-19 and Islamophobia online?
Yeah, specifically at COVID. Okay. I don't think I'm really in a position to answer that at the moment. But when we looked at this in 2018, in particular, around online abuse, it was clear, back then, very clear problems specifically with Islamophobia. Very recently, I've been speaking with a Muslim Labour MP, Naz Shah, who's been subjected to a lot of Islamophobic abuse online. And I think, yeah, there's very clear, there's very distinct, organised Islamophobic strands of abuse online. I haven't looked very closely at what's been happening with COVID. I think Zahed maybe mentioned in the chat that he's been looking at it. Might be better to answer it.
Zahed, are you able to answer that question?
Sorry, yeah, actually, and I was just responding to a similar question that was raised in the chat. We've been providing briefings on a regular basis on the trends. We've been collecting data to back up these trends. We haven't published that data yet because it's an ongoing process. We hope to soon to basically document in more detail the data behind what's being exploited online.
And Katie, do you have any information on that, the trends and patterns? Have you seen anything from the perspective of Twitter? Hi, Katie. I think you're on mute. I can't hear you. Maybe it's, yeah. Can everybody else hear Katie? No, we can't hear you, Katie. Okay, no worries. While Katie sorts out the technology, Zahed, from an American perspective, have you seen anything different from the American sort of angle?
Well, we're working with a number of partners in the US, actually, incidentally, on aggregating data around hate, not just with COVID-19, but in the run-up to the 2020 elections. And we're looking at from a very broad perspective, looking at groups, minority groups, including Muslims, Jewish groups, but also African-American groups. We're looking at voter disenfranchisement and all sorts of issues. So we've been aggregating quite a bit of data on the back of this. Some of it is social listening. Some of it is data that's actually been captured by partners of ours in the US. So early stages in the sense that, we've still got a few months to go before the elections, but it's providing some very interesting pictures on how these trends come in waves with regards to events on the ground, with regards to obviously George Floyd and so forth. So unfortunately, don't have any data to share at the moment, but we hope to have a bigger picture and be able to share more data in the weeks and months to come.
Thank you, Zahed. And I know a lot of researchers are doing a lot of work at the moment, so maybe this is filtering through and will come out very soon. Katie, have you got your mic working now?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. That's great.
Sorry about that. Do you mind just repeating the question?
Yes. Have you seen any sort of trends or patterns when it comes to Islamophobic hate speech in relation to COVID-19?
So with COVID-19, we have seen some attempts to manipulate the conversation at scale. We've challenged, I think the latest figures are just over 4 million accounts that looks like they were trying to interfere with the entire conversation around COVID-19. So be it creating multiple accounts, trying to spam the hashtag, I would some of that may have included hatred directed against certain communities. And what's important is we do disclose the full data set when we identify essentially state-backed information operations on Twitter. And we did a recent disclosure the Friday before last, which included some references again to COVID-19 that appeared to be being delivered by the Chinese state. I don't believe there were references to Islamophobia in that, but I think that the most important thing here is we do have a COVID-19 specific API that researchers can dock into So if there's anyone on this call who's using that to do research, looking specifically at trends in relation to the COVID-19 conversation, it would be great to pick that conversation up, and would love to collaborate on the research you're doing.
Thank you so much, Katie. And just to let people know, we'll have to wrap up now because of time, but we've had so many questions, and we'll make sure each of the panelists get the questions. I just want to thank all the panelists, because I know everybody's really busy, and to take the time out it means a lot, especially on this topic area. I'd like to thank Faith Forum for London, and Mustafa, of course, who helped a huge amount, especially behind the scenes. All the attendees who joined us as well. And of course, Roxana and Akila, who helped, especially with me with the technology and other things. So thank you all. I hope we stay connected, stay safe, and we'll send you some questions soon. Take care, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you all.